I'm Professor David Wilson. As a criminologist, I'm often asked, what's it like to interview a serial killer?
This is a tape-recorded interview. Date is 11/17/84.
In this new series, I'm going to take you on a journey into the dark heart of the police interrogation room. Using cutting-edge lip-sync technology, we'll bring to life the actual taped confessions of some of the world's most notorious murderers.
Put that pillowcase or whatever it looks like, cushion cover over her head.
And bring you face to face with evil.
Put her into the sleeping bag. No, I just slung her in the corner.
And along with forensic psychologist Professor Michael Brooks, I will analyse their interviews in unparalleled detail.
And while he was asleep, I put a noose around his neck. I throttled him with the noose and he hardly struggled.
Like the police detectives who interviewed them, you'll experience firsthand their cold and calculating minds.
I've never gone with my mum. I knew that she favoured my sister and me.
Their wicked words, now seen being spoken for the very first time, will never be forgotten.
The Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards.
The serial killer whose confession we examine in today's programme is one of the most prolific in British criminal history. He's someone I've interviewed myself on a number of occasions. He quite literally killed for company, befriending young men before inviting them back to his flat and strangling them to death from fear they would leave him when morning came. He was arrested in 1983 after human remains had been identified as the cause of blocked drains in the house where he had a flat. Within days, he'd confessed to 15 gruesome murders over a period of 4 years. The confessions are remarkable, not for the candid nature with which he speaks about his appalling crimes, but for the level of self-importance, the grandiosity, lack of empathy, and the narcissism that he displays, all of which are clearly psychopathic traits. The killer in question is someone who wants to hold his interviewer in thrall, wanting to share his dark secrets so as to shock and impress with every gory detail. Who is he? Denis Nilsen. On the 9th of February 1983, Denis Andrew Nilsen was taken into custody in Hornsey Police Station in London. On being questioned by detectives, he would willingly confess to a string of horrific murders that would send a shockwave across the country. In the years that followed, Nilsen would use every opportunity presented to him to recount his crimes in graphic detail.
It's almost impossible to imagine how any man could have committed murders of such grotesque depravity and kept the bodies over a period of months. That even to this day, it defies belief. It is beyond imagining. It is simply terrifying and horrifying.
Nilsen's victims were burned, buried, and even boiled. This latter method of disposal ultimately led to his dark secrets being exposed after he attempted to flush blanched innards down the toilet.
Dinah Rod sent an expert in to look at the drains. That's when they found the body parts blocking the drains. When they sent that to the lab, it was quite clear that they were human parts. Now, the police didn't really know what to do because they hadn't come across this type of behaviour before. But they tracked back, found him, and when they arrested him, he was quite quickly able to say to them, yes, I've done that. And in fact, when they asked how many, because they realised from the lab reports that they were dealing with a number of bodies, and he said 14, 15, 16. He didn't know.
As is the case with many serial murderers, when interviewed about his crimes, it was clear that for Nilsen, the boundaries between fact and fiction, fantasy and reality, were blurred.
Well, I was 12. I wasn't 15 or 16. When I was back of the police car, heading to the police station at the moment of my arrest, they asked me how many there were, and I didn't really know. I just gave them a figure. And because I was cooperating with the police, I decided I'll stick with it. You know?
One of the problems with serial killers is when they have committed a large number of homicides, they then genuinely forget. Then often they go to the extent of overemphasizing it because they want to make themselves sound even more dangerous and more important. But one thing that we do notice with quite a few serial killers is they like that element of control. They don't want to give all the information.
When DCI Peter J gets Nilsen into the police car to go to the station, Nilsen suddenly becomes extremely eloquent. He starts talking about, well, I could have killed 12, or I could have killed 15, or I could have killed 16, and which on the surface looks as though, oh, he's eager to clear his conscience. Not a bit of it. What he wants to do is to manipulate the police to his way of thinking. He wants to tell them a bit, but he doesn't want to tell them everything. He wants to be glamorous, and at the same time he wants to conceal. A typical Nilsen scheme.
There were three of those victims were invented just to complement the continuity of evidence of the police, because to keep them happy.
Denis Nilsen was very disarming in the actual police interviews. Very casual, very calm, not at all in any way demonstrative or aggressive or trying to impress. He almost was, well, you explain to me what I've been doing. I'm, this is all I know. And, he would explain it in very simple terms, which I think took the breath away of many police officers.
One of the most remarkable aspects about Nilsen's confession is that he began to make it almost the moment that handcuffs were snapped on, without even requesting a lawyer. I'm with forensic psychologist Professor Michael Brooks to examine aspects of Nilsen's confession in detail.
Well, I was 12. I wasn't 15 or 16. When I was at the back of the police car, heading to the police station at the moment of my arrest, they asked me how many there were, and I didn't really know. I just gave them a figure. And because I was cooperating with the police, I decided I'll stick with it. There were three of those victims were invented just to complement the continuity of evidence of the police, because to keep them happy.
I was really interested initially in this idea of him not knowing the number. He said, is it 12, 15, or 16? And he's inventing this idea that he's helping the police in terms of the continuity of the evidence. But what's that suggesting to you?
Well, the fact that he can't remember the numbers could well be that he found the whole experience extremely difficult. And actually he was trying to block out what he did. So he couldn't actually remember at a conscious level what had taken place.
Do you think this is because he's so completely dislocated from reality? Is this man completely and utterly operating on a different moral universe that the numbers of people he killed, he simply is blocking out?
I would contend he's not operating on a different moral universe. He's operating on the same universe, but he's finding what he did extremely difficult to cope with and adjust to.
The interviews that were recorded of Denis Nilsen, in his own mind, he thought that these would provide a great resource for the criminologically minded, for individuals involved in the investigation of crimes to actually understand more about him. This possibly does emanate from the idea that he presented very early on, in that he didn't really know why he did it himself, and he would like other people to find out.
He had a very tough upbringing. He wasn't very popular in school. He came from a poor background. He was bullied. He was aware of his sexual difference. He knew that he was different from other boys, but wasn't very sure how.
Denis Nilsen was a fairly troubled and very lonely character. He was someone who had difficulty in getting individuals to engage with him and stay engaged with him. He was really somebody who was kind of devoid of some kind of continuity in company.
The problem for him was he was desperate to find a relationship. He had several relationships, some which were short-term and very unsatisfactory. What he wanted was a long-term relationship. He wasn't getting that. He thought the boy was 17. And the boy went back to the flat to have more food, more drinks. And eventually they ended up in bed. The next morning, the boy wanted to go, and Nilsen wasn't happy with this.
But Nilsen went a little further. Nilsen was frightened that the fact that he'd strangled him hadn't completely killed him. And so, in what was to become a trademark of his killings, he took the young Irishman and stuffed his head in a bucket of water, effectively completing the job if it wasn't completed. He was a fetishist. He wanted to keep the body. He wanted to bathe the young Irishman, which he did, cleanse him, keep him, and eventually, as he put it rather chillingly, put him to bed under the floorboards. It was something that Nilsen continued to do in the further 14 killings.
In the end, it was when I was, say, 2 or 3 bodies under the floorboards began to accumulate that come the summer, it got hot, and I knew it would be a smell problem. But I thought, well, I'm going to have to deal with the smell problem. And I thought, what would cause the smell more than anything else? And I came to the conclusion it was the innards, the soft parts of the body, the organs and stuff like that.
The matter-of-fact approach is that if you've got a body, you've got to dispose of it eventually. You have to be quite practical in your approach. And he was. And this is where most people fail in killing, because people separate themselves psychologically and physically from the body when they've killed them, and they don't think about disposal. The difference between most homicides and the serial killer is the serial killer usually plans the disposal of the body. The serial killer doesn't want to get caught. He wants to go on quietly in his own way, in most cases, without getting attention. Nilsen didn't want attention from the police. He didn't let the police know what he was doing. He was quite happy to carry on in his life without any attention from the police.
So on a weekend, I would sort of pull out the floorboards, and I found it totally unpleasant, and would get blinding drunk, so I could face it, and start the dissection on the kitchen floor. And I'd go out and be sick outside in the gardens.
Denis Nilsen didn't have the full countenance, if you like, of an aggressive psychopath. He was very laid back, and this kind of obscured the fact that he was pretty cold-blooded and that he did kill people and cut them up. He does kind of allude to the idea that he went outside into the garden to vomit while he was hacking people up in his residence. However, this was probably not because the task revolted him. It was probably because the smell actually made him sick.
Nilsen's matter-of-fact and glib description of dismembering the bodies of his victims clearly demonstrates someone who's devoid of empathy, something which is very common among serial murderers. But as we're about to see, the scenes of indignation with which he greets the interviewer with when questioned about the mechanics of his murders causes his charming facade to crack. The veiled threats which follow affords a clear insight into how quickly his personality can change when he no longer feels powerful or in control of the situation. This need that he has to feel powerful and in control ultimately led to murder. Whenever an opportunity arose to tell his story, Nilsen was sure to embrace it, paying no heed to the fact that the deeds of which they proudly speak refer to ending human life.
That doesn't leave a mess. Why does it leave a mess? No, it doesn't. It doesn't leave a mess. You see, when people in death situations where a knife is involved, there's a lot of blood flying around. If I have to stab you right now, you have to stab me. The heart is pumping away there. There'll be blood splashing all over the place.
Denis Nilsen turned to his interviewer just to kind of elaborate on the idea that live bodies will ooze blood and that dead bodies where the blood's congealed just doesn't actually flow out. When he said, well, I could stab you or myself in that manner, whereby there was a kind of slipping of this genteel mask and the true violence within slipped out towards the interviewer.
Funny enough, in a dead body, there's no blood spurts or anything like that. It congeals inside and forms part of the flesh in there, and it becomes like anything in a butcher's shop. There's little or no blood. You know these plastic bags that you have, dustbin liners, you slit one of those so it forms kind of a sheet. You hold the body out onto the floorboards, put it on the sheet, and then cut it out.
Power and control are the two major factors in most serial killers. They like to be in control, they like the power that they have over people. And here we've got a situation where Nilsen was trying to a certain extent, intimidate in the interview. That's quite common. They want to try and control whatever little element they have, because one of the things in institutions is they have so little control of their lives. They're dictated by the very nature of the institution. They're dictated by people who often they feel are inferior to them.
So on a weekend, I would sort of pull out the floorboards, and I found it totally unpleasant, and I'd get blinding drunk, so I could face it, and start the dissection on the kitchen floor. I'd go out and be sick outside in the gardens.
Okay, Michael, for me, there comes across the dismembering of the bodies. He talks about having to be blinding drunk. And I do get a sense that alcohol plays a big part in Nilsen's life, not only in terms of being able to dismember bodies and chat these young men up in pubs, but alcohol is a huge issue for him, I think.
Yes, and in the sense, in terms of dismembering the bodies, it's to enable him to be able to carry out what otherwise would be an unpleasant task if he was conscious and fully aware of what he was doing. The only way that he can carry out the dismembering of the bodies is to be drunk. And in a sense, we don't know when he was sick in the garden, whether that was a consequence of too much alcohol, or whether it's the disgust at the idea of what he's having to do or having done.
Nilsen was a civil servant at the time that he was arrested, but 2 previous occupations are very important as well. Nilsen was in the Army catering corps, so he had butchering skills, and he had previously been a police officer. So some of those that employment context and background does find its way into these crimes, doesn't it?
Well, certainly in terms of the way that he was able to dismember the bodies and knowing what to do and how to do it. And then secondly, being a police officer, he would know of actions that needed to be taken. And he knew that when the summer came, the bodies would start smelling and that he would need to take some actions, he would need to dispose of them. Otherwise, suspicions would be aroused, and that would lead to further investigations, which is what he's wanting to avoid.
I do get the impression once or twice in this interview that Nilsen's mask slips and we begin to see the serial killer. Did you pick up on any points where that was important?
The one in which he threatened to stab the police officer is a case in point.
I'd love to stab you right now. You can stab me. The heart is pumping away there. There'll be blood splashing all over the place.
And the other one would be when Nilsen expresses disgust at the police officer for not knowing that actually if a body is dead and you cut it up, that there won't be any mess, there won't be any blood, that it's been congealed, which again is around an element of arrogance and superiority that sometimes comes out.
For most people, the idea of having someone who is dead as company would seem rather strange, because we'd normally expect to interact with that person and have them talk to us. In the case of Nilsen, he actually enjoyed people that were very kind of passive. He didn't want interaction much. He actually enjoyed the company of someone who was pronate, who didn't do anything, who he could kind of feel strong and powerful with. It was something that was deep in his psyche, it was deep in his sexuality, and it was deep in his childhood. It's very difficult for the normal person to understand how this kind of idea, this relationship with a corpse-like person, could actually arise. If you look in Nilsen's past, his grandfather, who was a big and important figure to him, was someone who would pick him up, throw him on his shoulders, and carry him around when they went for walks. This sensation of being a floppy, helpless person with a powerful person guiding them and sweeping them along, this was kind of the relationship that Nilsen was trying to create, only with himself as the powerful person and his victims as his friends that were passive.
Yes, one of the things he'd learnt in the army was to be passive. He wasn't the aggressive soldier, he was passive. His sexual behaviour with partners was always being passive and not the aggressor in a sexual relationship. And it's interesting that, according to him and from what little evidence we have, he did not penetrate any of his victims. His sexual behaviour was very insignificant compared to other serial killers. He was very passive sexually, he was very passive in his normal behaviour, which is in strong contrast when you consider the fact that he killed 14, 15, 16 people.
But he's now me. He's now my body in the fantasies. Carry him in, make him appear even better. Well, I would undress him and so he would be there. The most exciting part of the little conundrum was when I lifted the body, carried it.
He kept them because I think it proved his power. He kept them because they proved what he could do. What Nilsen wanted was to possess them. They were his. They were his property. Until he decided, and it was his decision to make, that he would gradually dismember them and get rid of their bodies.
Starting in 1978, Nilsen would conduct a 4-year campaign of terror that would see many young lives senselessly ended.
He would always cut the head off first, and then the hands, and then the feet. And then he would cut the body open, remove the soft organs, and carefully deposit them in different places. He kept a couple of heads in suitcases under rubble at the bottom of this rather disreputable garden that he had in Melrose Avenue.
Well, he was, at one stage, he was killing something like 4 or 5 people in a year, and that's quite a high rate of killing. But the problem is, you're never quite satisfied as a serial killer. It never quite matches all the drama, all the excitement that you want. And this is something that serial killers find, that eventually they have to kill again to get that pleasure. And what normally happens is the time period gets shorter and shorter. And again, we see this in Nilsen, that he had to kill because he needed another victim.
The murders of these young men came to form the epicenter of Nilsen's dark world. A world where sexual fantasy rapidly consumed all sense of reality. In the dominion of his flat, with the door closed and the outside world shut away, Nilsen was king and wore the emblems of power and control over his victims as his crown.
The bodies are all gone, everything's gone, there is nothing left. But I still feel in a spiritual communion with these people.
I believe that Nilsen, once his victims were dead, no longer regarded them as human. He was quite happy to confess to the police what he did, because to their bodies, because he didn't see them as real anymore. He saw them simply as his trophies. They were somehow no longer human. They did not represent a future, a life, a career, a relationship. They were simply something that needed to be dealt with, except that they represented something to him. They were no more than symbols.
Nilsen, along with many other serial killers, talked about him always carrying the spirit of his victims with him. Even if his victims were dismembered and disposed of, their spirit, as it were, was still with him and within him. He thought of himself as being the repository, as it were, for all of the people that he'd killed, almost as if they spiritually increased his value as a person. This is an odd characteristic, but a very narcissistic one. It may, in fact, be some kind of appeasement to police officers and others to say that, no, they're still here, it's okay. I didn't want to annihilate them.
Even to this day, when Nilsen talks about his crimes, he uses the experience to vicariously relive them through the listener. To him,
The bodies are all gone, everything's gone, there is nothing left. But I still feel in a spiritual communion with these people.
Do you get a sense of power and control? For me, there's a real issue here about him being narcissistic and needing to be powerful, like many serial killers.
And indeed, he makes reference to that in his statement, that what he enjoys most is when the victim is completely passive, because when the victim is completely passive, then he's in control, he has the power, and that's what he's yearning for, that's what he's been lacking. So he wants complete control and power over his victim.
But why the narcissism, Michael? Why is the narcissism such a common tool in the toolbox of serial killers?
Because it masks a fundamental inadequacy and vulnerability in terms of how they feel about themselves. And it's one way of them trying to get control and some power over their lives by getting power and control over others, and by acting in a way that society finds abhorrent and outside of societal norms.
And isn't that ironic? You and I have spent all our adult working lives managing violent men. And when we talk about the narcissism, it's because they are kind of weedy and needy, these serial killers. They're not the kind of Hollywood iconic figures at all that are powerful and talkative.
Which is why they target the weak and the vulnerable, those who are on the margins of society, because those are the people they have access to. They wouldn't carry these out against the strong characters that you make reference to, because actually, in comparison to them, they are weak and needy.
As a killer, Nilsen was not only coldly calculated in his choice of victims, but also in the formulation of the perfect front to execute his crimes.
Presented to the world as though he were perfectly innocent, ordinary, common garden bloke next door who'd had a decent career in the army and had a perfectly acceptable job in a job centre. He was a civil servant. There was nothing frightening about him. He didn't keep knives or do martial arts. He didn't wear hoods. He did nothing except, in the privacy of his flats, he killed, cut up, dismembered gay men.
Denis Nilsen was probably a wonderful chameleon as a serial killer. He disappeared into society. He didn't stand out. He didn't look particularly odd. He seemed quite normal and reasonable to most people that he met. In fact, quite charming in many ways. And he wasn't the very aggressive, psychopathic type individual that you would associate with that kind of thing. He was somebody who would probably make other people feel at ease and would actually respond to him very easily when he approached people, usually the destitute.
There's no doubt in my mind that Nilsen began to target, for sexual relations, men half his age. He had a particular attraction for teenagers and was anxious to have some kind of sexual relationship with them.
Tragically, Nilsen's killing spree could have been curtailed many years earlier. Police missed a golden opportunity when a survivor who had escaped his clutches complained to them.
In October 1979, Nilsen picked up a young man called Andrew Ho, whom he attacked, but did not strangle. Ho fought back, escaped, went to the police, and said, "I've been attacked by Denis Nilsen." The police interviewed Nilsen, who said, "Oh, it was a domestic affair between two gay men." Ho did not want to admit, because remember, it is 1979 and the gay community was still more secretive and secret than it is today. Ho did not want to admit he was gay and therefore did not press charges. You could call it an escape, you could call it a tragedy that Nilsen wasn't pursued and prosecuted. Remember, the attitude of the Metropolitan Police at that point was not particularly enlightened towards the gay community. It was, if anything, homophobic and not forgiving. Perhaps not surprisingly, Nilsen decides at this point, might be wise to move from Melrose Avenue. After all, I might need a different place to operate. But he doesn't quite think it through. He moves from Melrose Avenue to Cranley Gardens, but this time there's no garden. There's no rubble to hide bodies under. There's no garden for a fire. There's no fence at the back of the bit of garden that you can dump bits in. There's no places to put plastic bags. He's now got a much more constrained space. And ironically, it was that decision to move that probably was the reason for his eventual arrest and conviction.
Despite having no garden to use as a graveyard, Nilsen's urge to kill saw him murder 6 more men in the Cranley Gardens flat. He developed a new means of corpse disposal, but the old plumbing in his home would prove to be his undoing.
He was trying to dispose of his victims, and it got to the stage where they were actually backing up the drains.
I appear to have a problem with my drains. Is that something that you could possibly help me with?
A cleaning company were called to unblock the drains. They discovered, as they were doing so, all kinds of material, something that looks like chicken flesh. Could it be human? The cleaning company called the police. On the 9th of February, 1983, the senior investigating officer of these probably human remains in the drains at Cranley Garden waits for Nilsen outside the door to his house at the flat that Nilsen lives in with 2 colleagues and says to Nilsen, "Mr. Nilsen, we've come to talk to you about the drains. We've found," they go inside, "we found human remains." Now, once they're inside the flat in Cranley Gardens, there's no mistaking the smell of decomposing flesh. There's no mistaking the smell of death. None whatever. And Jay says to Nilsen, "Where are the rest of them?" It was at this point that Nilsen first begins to confess to the killings.
Many serial killers try to create their own myth and so like to philosophize as to why they committed such heinous crimes. Denis Nilsen is no exception. But Nilsen is no philosopher. He's a psychopath, a man who wanted to be the star of his own twisted movie and plotted the callous deaths of many young men's lives in order to achieve it.
The making myself look dead was nothing to do with death itself. It was making myself look as different from me as it was possible to imagine so that I could really be convincing as being somebody else.
The behaviour of dressing himself up or making himself up to be like a corpse is interesting because in many ways he may be representing dead people, but I suspect there's an element of his grandfather. He was devoted to his grandfather. He was shocked when his grandfather was dead, and he saw him. The first person he'd ever seen dead was his grandfather. And the practice in those days was to put a little bit of makeup on, make them look as well as they could under the circumstances in a coffin. I think maybe what he was doing in some ways was acting out his own grandfather's death scene and possibly his own death scene.
As with Nilsen, as with many other killers, you have to be aware of the fact that underneath whatever veneer has been put forward, there is a person who has reached out and violently killed other individuals by one means or another, hanging around just beneath the skin.
The making myself look dead was nothing to do with death itself. It was making myself look as different from me as it was possible to imagine, so that I could really be convincing as being somebody else.
One of the big things for me about Nilsen, again working with him and interviewing him on a number of occasions, and I'd be interested to hear your view, is that he's one of the few serial killers who talks. He talks endlessly about what he does. How unusual is that in your experience of working with violent men?
Well, I'm always very wary of what a serial offender says, and you have to locate what they say in their actions. Does what they're saying match with what they do or not?
Do you ever trust what a serial killer tells you?
No.
No, neither do I. It's ironic, isn't it?
But so you then have to look at the behaviours, look at the evidence, look at the actions, and that will tell you why they're doing what they're doing.
And my view is that Nilsen would have continued to do what he was doing if he hadn't started to flush body parts down the loo.
Well, he would have continued to do what he was doing until he was caught.
And he was only caught because the drains got blocked. Let's be honest, it wasn't because of fantastic policing, it was because of the Dynarod engineer.
And you'd have thought, actually, that he should have had sufficient awareness of that and actually found another way of disposing of the bodies and of the bones.
You're absolutely right. When he has access to a garden, he burns the bodies. And that's a way of destroying any evidence, of course, as well. When he moves home and has the top floor flat, he has this problem about what to do with the young men that he's killed. So there is a disposal issue. But I think by that stage that he has a number of young men have escaped from his clutches, and he still doesn't get arrested. And I think he feels powerful. I think that encourages him to continue to behave as he's done.
As with all serial offenders, they become overconfident, and which is why eventually they're caught, because they make errors.
Nilsen was tried at the Old Bailey, initially for the murder of 7 young men. No one present would ever forget the gruesome evidence laid out before them by the prosecution, nor the still figure of Nilsen in the dock.
He sat throughout the trial, almost unmoving. There were no tears, no remorse, there was no hysteria, there was no refusing to come into the dock. He simply sat there, calculating, watching the events unfold, probably knowing in his heart that this was inevitably going to end in his conviction, but determined never to display any sense of weakness. One of the things that Nilsen never ever did was to display weakness. Nilsen later said, and I think it's evidence of his intelligence, "My power lay in the victim's passivity. The more passive he was, therefore dead, the more powerful I was." And I think that goes to the heart of explaining Nilsen's actions. And in a phrase that haunts me, he said, "I shed no tears for my victims."
The confessions that Denis Nilsen made over the years clearly demonstrate a man who has no remorse and a killer who maintains a strong sense of pride about his wicked deeds.
As to the question of evil, that says more about society. People aren't born evil. They are corrupted by the world they live in, and the circumstances make them behave in certain ways, and they take a choice over how they behave. But we want them to be evil. We want them to be different from ourselves, because otherwise we're faced with the reality that most of us could become killers.
I think in Nilsen's confessions, he underlines his intelligence, his eloquence, his manipulation, his God complex, his acute awareness that he is very special and much more special than the officers who are charged with interrogating him. He preens himself. That is how he presents the image that he wants to give the world. I'm extremely clever. I got away with it for a very long time, and what's more, I am deeply proud of myself for doing so.